Behind the gilded gates of Ravenshollow Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and bow, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the Aldermere monarchy. Queen Consort Isabella Ravencrest, once beloved by the nation, now found herself standing in the marble halls where her fate would be decided by the man she had loved for 30 years. King Edmund's hands trembled as he held the ancient parchment that would strip away everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed for the crown. The decision that would tear apart not just a marriage, but a kingdom itself, was about to unfold in the most private and devastating family meeting the palace walls had ever witnessed. What had driven a king to betray the woman who had stood by his side through scandal, triumph, and the weight of an empire? The answer lay buried in secrets so dark that even the crown jewels seemed to dim in their shadow. The morning fog clung to the towers of Ravenshollow Palace like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the ancient stones that had witnessed 5 centuries of royal drama. Queen Consort Isabella Ravencrest stood at the tall windows of her private chambers, watching the early light struggle through the mist. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. Gone was the confident smile that had charmed millions during royal tours, replaced by the haunted expression of someone who had discovered that love and loyalty meant nothing when weighed against the survival of a crown. The summons had arrived 3 hours earlier, delivered by the king's private secretary with the kind of formal politeness that masked devastating news. A family meeting, the parchment had read, to discuss matters of utmost importance to the crown. Isabella had served as queen consort for 15 years, long enough to know that such meetings were never called for pleasant announcements. Her hands shook as she folded the heavy paper, the royal seal still warm from the wax. She thought back to the conversation she had overheard just 2 weeks prior, when she had been walking past the king's study late one evening. The voices had been low but urgent, and she had caught fragments that made her blood run cold. Lord Chancellor Pemberton's distinctive gravelly tone had been unmistakable as he spoke of constitutional crises and the need for drastic action. King Edmund's responses had been too quiet to hear clearly, but the tone had been that of a man under enormous pressure. Isabella moved away from the window and began pacing the length of her sitting room, her silk morning gown rustling with each step. The room was a study in understated elegance, decorated in soft blues and golds that complemented her favorite sapphire jewelry set. Every piece had been chosen carefully over the years, each item a small assertion of her personal taste within the rigid confines of royal protocol. Now, looking at her carefully curated surroundings, she wondered how much longer she would be able to call this space her own. The relationship between Isabella and Edmund had never been the fairy tale that the public believed it to be. They had met at a charity gala when she was 35, already an established diplomat with a sharp mind for international relations and a reputation for discretion. Edmund, then Prince of Aldermere, had been immediately drawn to her intelligence and poise. Their courtship had been brief but intense, conducted largely away from the public eye until their engagement announcement sent shockwaves through the establishment. The opposition to their marriage had been fierce and immediate. Isabella was a commoner, despite her diplomatic credentials, and at 35, she was considered too old to provide the heirs that the monarchy desperately needed. The press had been merciless, dubbing her the Ice Queen for her reserved demeanor during public appearances. But Edmund had been unwavering in his support, publicly defending her against critics and privately reassuring her that their love would weather any storm. Their wedding had been a magnificent affair, watched by billions around the world. Isabella had looked radiant in her ivory silk gown, designed by the kingdom's most celebrated couturier. The cathedral had been filled with heads of state and nobility from across Europe, all gathered to witness what many hoped would be a new chapter for the Aldermere monarchy. The vows they exchanged had been traditional, but Edmund had surprised everyone by adding a personal promise to always protect and cherish his bride, no matter what challenges they might face. The early years of their marriage had indeed been blissful. Isabella had thrown herself into her royal duties with characteristic determination, learning the intricate protocols of court life while using her diplomatic background to strengthen international relationships. She had been particularly successful in her work with children's charities, her genuine warmth with young people contrasting beautifully with her more formal public persona. The press had gradually warmed to her, and by the time Edmund ascended to the throne, Isabella had become genuinely beloved by the people. But the issue of children had remained a constant source of pressure. Isabella had suffered 3 miscarriages in their first 5 years of marriage, each loss devastating not just personally but in terms of the constitutional crisis it represented. The kingdom needed an heir, and with each failed pregnancy, the whispers grew louder. Opposition politicians began to question whether the marriage had been a mistake, whether the crown would be better served by different arrangements. Isabella had endured it all with grace, never speaking publicly about their private struggles, but throwing herself even more deeply into her charitable work. She had established the Ravencrest Foundation, focusing on maternal and child health, partly as a way to channel her own grief into something positive. The foundation had become hugely successful, raising millions for hospitals and research programs across the Commonwealth. Edmund had been supportive throughout their fertility struggles, at least publicly. Privately, Isabella had sometimes caught him looking at her with what she interpreted as disappointment, though he never voiced any criticism. They had explored every medical option available, consulting with specialists across Europe and even considering adoption, though constitutional lawyers had advised against it due to succession laws. The turning point had come 3 years earlier, when Isabella turned 50. The doctors had been frank about the reality of their situation, and Isabella had made the difficult decision to stop trying. She had expected Edmund to be relieved, to finally put the pressure of producing an heir behind them, and focus on being the royal couple that the kingdom needed. Instead, she had sensed him pulling away, becoming more distant and formal in their private interactions. The rumors had started about a year later. Whispers in the corridors of power about the king's growing friendship with Lady Catherine Ashworth, a vibrant widow in her early 30s who had recently been appointed to the board of the Royal Opera House. Catherine was everything that Isabella was not at this stage of her life: young, fertile, and blessed with the kind of effortless charisma that made people gravitate toward her. She was also, according to palace gossip, developing a very close relationship with the king. Isabella had tried to ignore the speculation, focusing on her duties and maintaining the dignity that had always been her strength. But it became impossible to ignore when she began to notice the small changes in Edmund's behavior. He spent more evenings at official functions without her, claiming they were too boring for her to attend. He had started taking separate cars to events, explaining it was more efficient for their security details. Most tellingly, he had moved into a separate bedroom suite 6 months earlier, citing his insomnia and irregular schedule. The previous month, things had come to a head when photographs appeared in the tabloid press showing Edmund and Catherine at a private dinner in a countryside inn, far from the usual royal haunts. The images were grainy and taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the intimate nature of their conversation or the way Catherine's hand rested on Edmund's arm. The palace's response had been swift and standard, dismissing the photos as an innocent working dinner to discuss arts patronage. But Isabella had known better. That evening, she had confronted Edmund in his study, demanding to know the truth about his relationship with Catherine. The conversation had been devastating. Edmund had not denied the relationship, but had refused to discuss details, instead focusing on what he called the bigger picture. The monarchy was in crisis, he had explained. Public support was waning, particularly among younger generations who saw the royal family as an expensive anachronism. The Commonwealth was fragmenting, with several nations considering severing their ties to the crown. Edmund had spoken about duty and sacrifice, about the need to make difficult decisions for the greater good. He had talked about the importance of securing the succession, about providing the kingdom with hope for the future. Isabella had listened in growing horror as she realized what he was suggesting, that their marriage had become a liability to the crown, that his future lay with a younger woman who could give him the heirs that she never could. Now, as she prepared for what she suspected would be the most important meeting of her life, Isabella reflected on the irony of her situation. She had given up her successful diplomatic career to serve the crown, had endured years of public scrutiny and private heartbreak, had dedicated herself completely to the role of queen consort. And it seemed that none of it mattered when weighed against the ancient imperatives of royal succession. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret Thornfield, entered with a tea service and the morning newspapers. Margaret had been with Isabella since her engagement to Edmund, a steady presence through all the ups and downs of royal life. Now in her 60s, Margaret possessed the rare combination of absolute discretion and genuine affection for her employer that made her invaluable. "The papers, Your Majesty," Margaret said quietly, setting down the silver tray with practiced efficiency. though perhaps this morning it would be better to avoid them entirely. Isabella smiled grimly at her aide's protective instincts. That bad? The speculation continues, Margaret replied diplomatically. There are suggestions that major changes may be announced soon. Isabella picked up the top newspaper, a conservative broadsheet that had always been supportive of the monarchy. The headline made her stomach lurch. Palace insiders suggest major royal announcement imminent. The article was full of unnamed sources and carefully worded speculation, but the implication was clear. Something significant was about to happen, and it involved the queen consort's future role. She set the paper aside without reading further. There was no point in torturing herself with the media speculation when she would soon have the truth, whatever that might be. Instead, she focused on preparing herself for the meeting that would determine her fate. Isabella chose her outfit carefully, settling on a navy blue wool dress that conveyed both dignity and strength. She added her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom that had always brought her comfort in difficult times. Her makeup was subtle but flawless, her hair styled in the elegant chignon that had become her signature look. If this was to be her last day as queen consort, she would face it looking every inch the royal she had worked so hard to become. As she made her final preparations, Isabella's thoughts turned to the life she had built within the palace walls. She thought about the staff members who had become like family, the charitable causes that depended on her patronage, the routine of royal duties that had given her life structure and purpose. Most of all, she thought about the love she still felt for Edmund, despite everything that had happened between them. The morning sun had finally broken through the fog, casting long shadows across the palace gardens. From her window, Isabella could see the tourists gathering at the palace gates, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. They had no idea that behind the pageantry and tradition, real human drama was unfolding, that hearts were breaking and dreams were dying within the very walls they admired. Margaret returned to inform her that the king was ready for the meeting. As Isabella made her way through the familiar corridors toward Edmund's private study, she steeled herself for whatever was to come. She had survived public humiliation, personal loss, and years of intense scrutiny. Whatever happened in the next hour, she would face it with the grace and dignity that had defined her entire royal career. The heavy oak doors of the king's study loomed ahead, guarded by two immaculately dressed footmen. As they opened the doors to admit her, Isabella took a deep breath and stepped forward to meet her destiny, knowing that nothing in her carefully ordered world would ever be the same again. The king's private study had always been Edmund's sanctuary within the palace, a masculine retreat where dark wood paneling and leather-bound books created an atmosphere of gravitas and tradition. Heavy burgundy drapes blocked out most of the morning light, leaving the room illuminated by the warm glow of table lamps and the flickering flames in the massive stone fireplace. It was here that Edmund made the most important decisions of his reign, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and the weight of centuries of royal history. As Isabella entered the room, she immediately sensed the gravity of the situation from the people assembled there. Edmund stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of stress. His silver hair, normally perfectly styled, looked as though he had been running his hands through it. His face, which had aged considerably since ascending to the throne 5 years earlier, bore the expression of a man about to undertake an unpleasant but necessary task. To Edmund's right stood Lord Chancellor Pemberton, his weathered face grave as he clutched a leather portfolio containing what Isabella assumed were the legal documents that would seal her fate. Sir James Whitmore, the palace's senior constitutional lawyer, stood nearby with his own collection of papers. Most surprising of all was the presence of Archbishop Thornton, whose role in this gathering suggested that matters of much greater significance than a simple title change were being discussed. Isabella, Edmund said formally, his voice lacking the warmth that had once characterized their private conversations. Thank you for coming. Please, take a seat. The chair that had been prepared for her faced the assembled group like a defendant before a tribunal. Isabella maintained her composure as she sat down, folding her hands in her lap, and meeting each man's gaze with the steady confidence that had served her well throughout her public life. Whatever they were about to tell her, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Lord Chancellor Pemberton cleared his throat and opened his portfolio, removing a thick document bound in the traditional red ribbon of official royal business. Your Majesty, he began, addressing Isabella with the formal title that now felt somehow hollow. We have convened this meeting to discuss matters of constitutional importance that affect both your position and the future stability of the crown. Isabella's heart was beating rapidly, but her voice remained steady. I understand this involves my role as queen consort. I assume you wish to discuss modifications to my duties, or perhaps a change in my public schedule. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Edmund looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. It was Sir James who finally spoke, his legal training allowing him to deliver devastating news in measured, professional tones. I'm afraid the matter is rather more serious than that, Your Majesty. We are here to discuss the dissolution of your marriage to His Majesty and your subsequent removal from all royal titles and positions. The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Although she had suspected that her marriage was in trouble, the formal announcement of divorce proceedings in such a clinical setting was somehow more brutal than she had imagined. She gripped the arms of her chair, fighting to maintain her composure as the room seemed to spin around her. Divorce, she repeated quietly, testing the word as though it were a foreign concept. And this decision has been made without any discussion with me. Edmund finally looked up, his expression pained but resolute. Isabella, this isn't about personal feelings or private disagreements. This is about the survival of the monarchy itself. The constitutional crisis we face requires decisive action. Archbishop Thornton stepped forward, his clerical robes rustling softly. Your Majesty, I want you to understand that this decision has not been made lightly. We have spent months consulting with constitutional experts, religious authorities, and political advisors. The consensus is clear that drastic action is necessary to preserve the crown for future generations. Isabella forced herself to ask the question that she dreaded hearing answered. And I assume this drastic action involves the king's remarriage to a younger woman who can provide the heirs that I cannot? The uncomfortable shuffling that followed her question confirmed what she already knew. Lord Chancellor Pemberton consulted his notes before responding. The king's engagement to Lady Catherine Ashworth will be announced simultaneously with the finalization of divorce proceedings. Their wedding is planned for 6 months hence, with the coronation of the new queen consort to follow immediately. The clinical nature of the discussion was almost surreal. Isabella was listening to the dismantling of her life being discussed as though it were a routine matter of state business, complete with timelines and protocol considerations. The 15 years she had spent as Edmund's wife, the decades of service to the crown, the sacrifices she had made, all reduced to a constitutional inconvenience to be tidily resolved. What about our marriage vows? Isabella asked, her voice gaining strength as anger began to override her shock. Before God and the people of this kingdom, you promised to love, honor, and cherish me until death do us part. Are those words meaningless when they become politically inconvenient? Edmund's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Isabella saw a flash of the man she had fallen in love with, conflicted and in pain. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the mask of duty that had become his default expression in recent years. Isabella, I understand this is difficult, he said carefully. But we cannot allow personal sentiment to override our responsibility to the crown. The monarchy is facing its greatest crisis in centuries. Public support is eroding, particularly among younger generations. The Commonwealth is fragmenting. We need to demonstrate that the royal family is capable of adapting and securing the succession. Sir James opened his own portfolio and removed a thick stack of papers. The legal proceedings have been carefully structured to minimize publicity and constitutional disruption. The Archbishop has worked with religious authorities to ensure that the dissolution can be accomplished without creating a crisis of faith. The grounds will be mutual incompatibility and the constitutional necessity of securing the succession. Isabella laughed bitterly at the euphemistic language being used to describe her humiliation. Mutual incompatibility. How wonderfully diplomatic. And what role did I play in determining this mutual incompatibility? Your Majesty, Lord Chancellor Pemberton interjected. I think it would be helpful to review the practical arrangements that have been made for your transition. The Crown recognizes your many years of devoted service and wishes to ensure that you are provided for appropriately. He handed her a bound document that she assumed contained the terms of her exile from royal life. As she scanned the pages, Isabella was struck by the thoroughness with which her future had been planned without her input. She would retain a substantial financial settlement, including a London townhouse and a country estate. Her charitable patronages would be transferred to other members of the royal family. She would be expected to maintain a dignified silence about the circumstances of her divorce, and would be prohibited from writing memoirs or giving interviews about her royal experience. Quite generous, Isabella observed dryly. A comfortable prison with golden bars. And if I refuse to go quietly? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Edmund leaned forward, his expression hardening. Isabella, I hope you won't force us to make this more unpleasant than it needs to be. You have always been intelligent and pragmatic. Surely you can see that cooperation serves everyone's best interests. Isabella set down the document and looked around the room at the men who had decided her fate. Gentlemen, you seem to have forgotten something important about my background. I spent 20 years as a diplomat before I married Edmund. I understand political maneuvering and the art of negotiation. Did it occur to any of you that I might have my own thoughts about this proposal? Archbishop Thornton shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, what exactly are you suggesting? Isabella stood up, her movement causing all four men to take an involuntary step backward. The balance of power in the room had suddenly shifted, and she could see uncertainty in their eyes. For the first time since entering the study, she felt a measure of control returning. I'm suggesting that you have underestimated both my intelligence and my options, she said calmly. You have clearly spent months planning this ambush, consulting with lawyers and advisors, structuring financial arrangements, and publicity strategies. But you have made one crucial error in your calculations. Edmund frowned, clearly not expecting this response. What error? Isabella smiled, and there was something almost predatory in her expression. You have forgotten that I am not just Edmund's wife. I am a royal consort with my own relationships, my own sources of information, and my own understanding of how power works in this kingdom. Did you really think that I was unaware of your plans? That I hadn't noticed the private meetings, the hushed conversations, the carefully orchestrated campaign to marginalize me? Lord Chancellor Pemberton's face had gone pale. Your Majesty, I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Isabella replied firmly. I'm stating facts. Over the past 6 months, I have been building my own network of supporters, both within the palace and beyond. I have documented evidence of every private meeting, every secret negotiation, every step in your conspiracy to remove me from my rightful position. She reached into her handbag and removed a small recording device, placing it on Edmund's desk where all four men could see it clearly, including this conversation. Every word you have spoken here today has been recorded and will be made available to my legal team within the hour. The silence that followed was deafening. Edmund stared at the device as though it were a venomous snake, while Sir James began frantically making notes on his legal pad. Archbishop Thornton's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and Lord Chancellor Pemberton seemed to have lost the power of speech entirely. Furthermore, Isabella continued, her confidence growing with each word, I have spent the past month meeting with constitutional experts of my own, individuals whose reputations and knowledge rival those of your carefully selected advisors. They have provided me with some fascinating insights into the legal and political implications of what you are attempting to do. Edmund finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you talking about? Isabella moved closer to his desk, her eyes never leaving his face. I'm talking about the fact that your plan to divorce me and remarry is not just morally questionable, it's potentially catastrophic for the monarchy you claim to be protecting. Did your advisors happen to mention that 3 Commonwealth nations have already indicated they will consider severing ties with the crown if you proceed with this course of action? Did they tell you that the Archbishop of Canterbury has serious reservations about blessing a second marriage under these circumstances? Did they inform you that public polling shows approval ratings for the monarchy dropping to historic lows since rumors of your affair began circulating? Each revelation hit the assembled group like a hammer blow. Isabella could see the confidence draining from their faces as they realized that their carefully constructed plan was far more complicated than they had anticipated. The woman they had expected to dismiss quietly was proving to be a formidable opponent with resources and information they hadn't counted on. Most importantly, Isabella concluded, did any of you consider the legal ramifications of attempting to dissolve a marriage based on the bride's inability to produce children? Because according to my constitutional lawyers, such grounds could set a precedent that would fundamentally undermine the entire institution of royal marriage. Future queens could be disposed of for any physical limitation or personal characteristic deemed inconvenient by the crown. Sir James looked up from his frantic note-taking, his face ashen. Your Majesty, are you threatening to contest the divorce? Isabella returned to her chair and sat down with deliberate composure, her hands folded in her lap. I'm not threatening anything, Sir James. I'm simply ensuring that all parties involved understand the full scope of what is being proposed here today. You have presented me with a fait accompli, expecting me to accept exile graciously in exchange for financial compensation. But you have gravely underestimated both my capabilities and my determination to protect the institution I have served faithfully for 15 years. The power dynamic in the room had completely reversed. The four men who had entered the meeting confident in their ability to control the narrative now found themselves facing an opponent who had clearly anticipated their moves and prepared accordingly. Isabella could see the doubt creeping into their expressions as they began to realize that their carefully planned coup might not proceed as smoothly as they had hoped. What do you want, Isabella? Edmund asked finally, his formal composure cracking under the pressure of this unexpected turn of events. Isabella smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. What I want, Your Majesty, is to ensure that if you insist on destroying our marriage for political expediency, you do so with full understanding of the consequences. Not just for me, but for the crown, for the Commonwealth, and for the future of the monarchy that we both claim to serve. She stood up again, gathering her handbag and moving toward the door with regal dignity. I suggest you consult with your advisors more thoroughly before making any public announcements. You may find that the constitutional crisis you are trying to solve is nothing compared to the one you are about to create. As she reached the door, Isabella turned back one final time. Gentlemen, you have reminded me today why I was successful in my diplomatic career before I became queen consort. You should never begin a negotiation until you fully understand the position and capabilities of all parties involved. It appears you have some homework to do. With that, she swept from the room, leaving four very powerful men staring at each other in stunned silence, the comfortable certainty of their plans suddenly replaced by the uncomfortable realization that Queen Consort Isabella Ravencrest was far from defeated. The battle for her crown had only just begun. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Isabella's private study as she sat across from Victoria Blackwood, the most formidable constitutional lawyer in the kingdom. Victoria's reputation preceded her into any room. A sharp-minded woman in her 50s who had built her career on defending the seemingly indefensible and finding legal solutions that others deemed impossible. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, and her dark blue suit conveyed the kind of professional authority that made even senior judges think twice before challenging her arguments. Spread across Isabella's antique writing desk were dozens of legal documents, constitutional precedents, and historical records that Victoria had assembled over the past month. The sheer volume of material was staggering, representing centuries of royal law and tradition that could potentially support Isabella's position. But, as Victoria had made clear from their first meeting, the law was only as strong as one's ability to wield it effectively. Your Majesty, Victoria began, her voice carrying the crisp precision that had made her legendary in courtrooms across Europe. I want to be absolutely clear about what we are facing. The King's legal team is not merely seeking a divorce. They are attempting to rewrite fundamental constitutional principles to justify what is essentially the political disposal of an inconvenient queen. Isabella nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a particularly thick legal brief. And our position? Stronger than they imagine, but more complex than we would prefer, Victoria replied candidly. The beauty of our constitutional monarchy is also its greatest weakness from their perspective. Centuries of precedent and tradition create layers of legal protection that cannot simply be dismissed for political convenience. Victoria opened the largest folder on the desk and removed a series of historical documents, each one carefully preserved and annotated. Let us begin with the most fundamental question. Under what legal authority does the king believe he can dissolve your marriage without your consent? Isabella examined the documents Victoria had prepared, each one representing a different aspect of royal marriage law that had evolved over centuries. The complexity was staggering, involving not just civil law but ecclesiastical authority, parliamentary oversight, and constitutional tradition. The Succession Act of 1701 established that royal marriages require the consent of the crown, Victoria explained, pointing to a specific passage in an ancient document. But it says nothing about the crown's authority to dissolve such marriages unilaterally. The Marriage Act of 1836 brought royal marriages under the same basic legal framework as those of ordinary citizens, which means they are subject to the same protections and procedures. Isabella frowned as she studied the legal precedents. But surely there must be historical examples of royal divorces that they can cite? Victoria smiled grimly. Indeed there are, and that is precisely where their argument begins to unravel. Every significant royal divorce in our history has either involved mutual consent or clear grounds of misconduct. King Edward VIII abdicated rather than attempt to divorce his wife against her will. The divorces of Princess Margaret and Princess Anne were both consensual and involved no constitutional implications regarding succession. She pulled out another set of documents, these ones more recent. What your husband's advisors are attempting is unprecedented. The involuntary dissolution of a royal marriage for purely political reasons, justified by the Queen Consort's inability to produce children. From a legal standpoint, this sets several extremely dangerous precedents. Isabella leaned forward, her interest sharpening. What kind of precedents? First, it establishes that royal marriages can be dissolved by the Crown for reasons of state policy, regardless of the consent of both parties. Second, it creates a legal framework that treats infertility as grounds for involuntary divorce. Third, it suggests that the personal circumstances of royal spouses can be altered unilaterally to serve political objectives. Victoria's expression grew more serious as she continued. Your Majesty, if this precedent is established, no future royal spouse will have any security in their position. A future king could dispose of an aging queen, a queen who becomes ill, or a queen who simply becomes politically inconvenient, all under the justification that the change serves the interests of the crown. Isabella felt a chill as she realized the full implications of what Victoria was describing. This isn't just about my marriage. It's about fundamentally altering the nature of royal marriage itself. Exactly. And that brings us to the ecclesiastical dimension of this case. Victoria opened another folder containing correspondence with various religious authorities. Archbishop Thornton may have agreed to participate in their plan, but he does not speak for the entire Church of England, much less the broader Anglican communion. Isabella examined the letters Victoria had collected, each one from a different religious authority expressing concerns about the proposed divorce. The Archbishop of Canterbury had written a particularly strongly worded response questioning the spiritual and moral implications of dissolving a marriage that had been blessed by God and witnessed by millions. The Church's position is complex, Victoria explained. While they have accepted royal divorces in the past, those cases involved different circumstances. The Church has never blessed the involuntary dissolution of a marriage for political expedience. Several senior bishops have privately indicated that they would refuse to participate in a coronation ceremony for Lady Catherine if the divorce proceeds under these circumstances. Isabella set down the ecclesiastical correspondence and looked directly at Victoria. What about the political implications? Edmund's advisors seem to believe that the monarchy is in crisis and that this drastic action is necessary to save it. Victoria's expression darkened. Their political analysis is not just flawed, it's potentially catastrophic. I have been in communication with political advisors across the Commonwealth, and the consensus is clear. This divorce would create far more problems than it solves. She pulled out a folder containing polling data and political analysis from across the Commonwealth realms. The numbers made for sobering reading. Public approval for the monarchy had indeed declined in recent years, but the proposed solution was likely to make things much worse. Public opinion polling shows that while support for the monarchy has declined, support for you personally remains remarkably high, Victoria explained. The public sees you as dignified, hardworking, and devoted to your charitable causes. Disposing of you to make way for a younger woman would be seen as callous and calculating, particularly given the circumstances of the king's relationship with Lady Catherine. Isabella studied the polling data with the analytical eye she had developed during her diplomatic career. The numbers told a clear story. The public might be losing interest in the monarchy as an institution, but they maintained genuine affection for her personally. Edmund's advisors had fundamentally misread the political landscape. Moreover, Victoria continued, 3 Commonwealth nations have already indicated through diplomatic channels that they would seriously consider severing their ties to the crown if this divorce proceeds. The governments of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have all expressed concern about the precedent being set and the damage to the monarchy's reputation. Isabella leaned back in her chair, absorbing the full scope of what Victoria had revealed. So their solution to a political crisis would actually create a much larger political crisis? Precisely. And that brings us to our strategy for responding to their ultimatum. Victoria's expression became sharply focused, the look of a lawyer preparing for battle. We have several options, each with different risks and potential outcomes. Victoria outlined the first option, complete resistance. Isabella could refuse to consent to the divorce, forcing Edmund's team to pursue involuntary dissolution through the courts. This would create a lengthy, public legal battle that would expose all the constitutional and political weaknesses in their position. The advantage, Victoria explained, is that we would almost certainly win. The legal precedents are on our side, and the political costs to the crown would be enormous. The disadvantage is that the battle itself would damage the monarchy, regardless of the outcome. The second option was conditional cooperation. Isabella could agree to the divorce, but only under specific terms that protected both her interests and the constitutional principles at stake. This would require extensive negotiations and would likely take months to resolve. This approach allows us to control the narrative and ensure that any agreement serves your interests while minimizing damage to the monarchy, Victoria noted. But it requires Edmund's team to negotiate in good faith, which may not be possible given their current position. The third option was the most aggressive, a counteroffensive that would expose the full extent of Edmund's misconduct and the constitutional violations his advisors were attempting. This would involve making public all the evidence Isabella had gathered, including recordings of private meetings and documentation of the conspiracy to remove her. This approach would almost certainly destroy Edmund's reign and potentially end the monarchy entirely, Victoria warned. But it would also ensure that you are not quietly disposed of and that the constitutional principles at stake are fully aired in public. Isabella considered each option carefully, weighing the personal and political implications of each choice. The diplomatic training that had served her so well throughout her royal career was now being called upon in the most personal and high-stakes negotiation of her life. Victoria, what would you do in my position? Isabella asked finally. Victoria smiled, and for the first time that afternoon, there was genuine warmth in her expression. Your Majesty, in my experience, the most effective approach is usually to let your opponents reveal the weakness of their position before you reveal the strength of yours. They have shown their hand with this morning's ultimatum. Now it's time to show them that they have gravely underestimated both your capabilities and your determination. Isabella nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in her mind. What do you need from me to proceed? First, I need your formal authorization to begin discovery proceedings. We need to document every aspect of their conspiracy, from the initial planning stages to this morning's meeting. Second, I need you to begin reaching out to your network of international contacts. The Commonwealth governments need to understand exactly what is being proposed and what the implications would be for their relationships with the Crown. Victoria gathered the documents spread across the desk and organized them into neat stacks. Most importantly, Your Majesty, I need you to be prepared for what comes next. Once we begin this process, there will be no going back. The gloves will come off, and the battle will be public, intense, and potentially devastating for everyone involved. Isabella stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the palace gardens where tourists continued to gather, unaware of the constitutional crisis unfolding behind the ornate facade. The weight of responsibility was enormous not just to herself, but to the institution of royal marriage, to the constitutional principles that govern the monarchy, and to the millions of people across the Commonwealth who look to the Crown for stability and moral leadership. Victoria, she said finally, turning back to face her lawyer, 15 years ago, I made vows before God and the people of this kingdom. I promised to serve the Crown faithfully, to support my husband in his duties, and to uphold the dignity of the royal family. I have kept those promises, even when it cost me personally. She moved back to the desk and picked up the recording device she had used that morning, holding it up so Victoria could see it clearly. But I also made another promise, one that I have never spoken aloud but have carried in my heart since the day I became queen consort. I promised myself that I would never allow the institution of royal marriage to be degraded or perverted for political convenience. Today, that promise has been tested. Isabella placed the recording device back on the desk with deliberate precision. Begin discovery proceedings immediately. Contact our allies in the Commonwealth governments. And prepare for war, because that is what this has become. Edmund and his advisors have chosen to treat this as a political calculation rather than a matter of honor and principle. They are about to learn that they have made a grave error in judgment. Victoria nodded, already mentally organizing the complex legal and political campaign that lay ahead. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave, she looked back at Isabella with genuine admiration. "Your Majesty, they expected you to go quietly, to accept exile gracefully in exchange for financial security. They have no idea what they have awakened." Isabella smiled, and there was steel in her expression. "No, they don't. But they are about to find out." As Victoria left to begin the legal battle that would determine the future of the monarchy, Isabella remained at her window, watching the sun set over the kingdom she had served so faithfully. The war for her crown was about to begin, and she intended to fight it with every weapon at her disposal. Edmund and his advisors had underestimated the woman they had tried to discard, and that mistake would cost them more than they could possibly imagine. The morning newspapers lay scattered across Isabella's breakfast table like fallen soldiers on a battlefield, each headline more sensational than the last. Victoria Blackwood had arrived at the palace before dawn with the first editions, her expression grim as she surveyed the media carnage that had erupted overnight. The careful balance of power that had existed just 24 hours earlier had been completely shattered, replaced by a full-scale publicity war that threatened to consume everything in its path. "Queen fights back," screamed the front page of the Times, while The Guardian had opted for the more restrained, "Constitutional crisis rocks palace." The tabloids had abandoned any pretense of subtlety, with headlines ranging from "Isabella's revenge" to "Royal marriage wars." Someone had leaked details of the previous day's confrontation, and the story had exploded across every form of media in the kingdom. Isabella studied each publication with the analytical detachment she had learned during her diplomatic career, noting which outlets seemed to favor her position and which appeared to be receiving information from Edmund's camp. The battle lines were being drawn in public, and she needed to understand the terrain before making her next move. The leak came from their side, Victoria observed, settling into the chair across from Isabella with a cup of strong black coffee. "This is a classic political maneuver designed to force your hand. By making the conflict public, they're hoping to pressure you into accepting their terms rather than enduring a prolonged media battle." Isabella set down the most inflammatory of the tabloid reports and looked directly at her lawyer. "Then, they've made another miscalculation. I've survived 15 years of media scrutiny as queen consort. I'm not easily intimidated by newspaper headlines." Victoria smiled approvingly. "I hoped you would see it that way, because the leak has actually provided us with an unexpected opportunity. The public nature of the conflict means we can now respond openly rather than fighting a shadow war behind palace doors." She opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder of documents, each one carefully tabbed and organized. "I've spent the night coordinating with our allies, and the response has been more supportive than we dared hope. The Commonwealth governments are furious about the way this has been handled, and several senior bishops have issued statements questioning the moral and legal foundations of the king's position." Isabella examined the statements Victoria had collected, each one representing another ally in her fight for survival. The Prime Minister of Canada had issued a carefully worded but pointed statement expressing concern about constitutional precedents that could affect the stability of the crown. The Archbishop of Canterbury had been more direct, calling for careful reflection and dialogue rather than precipitous action that could damage the moral authority of the monarchy. "Most importantly," Victoria continued, "we've received private assurances from 3 senior judges that they would have serious reservations about approving an involuntary royal divorce under these circumstances. The legal precedents simply don't support Edmund's position, and the judiciary is reluctant to create new law to serve political convenience." Isabella nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "What about public opinion? The polls you showed me yesterday were encouraging, but how will people react to this becoming a public battle?" Victoria pulled out the latest polling data, conducted overnight by 3 different organizations. The numbers were revealing and somewhat surprising. Despite the sensational headlines, public support for Isabella had actually increased since the story broke. The British people, it seemed, did not appreciate seeing their queen consort ambushed and humiliated for political purposes. "The public sees this as a powerful woman being bullied by a group of men," Victoria explained. "The image of you facing down the king and his advisors in that study has resonated strongly, particularly with women voters. Edmund's approval ratings have dropped 10 points overnight, while yours have risen by 8 points." Isabella studied the polling data with interest, noting the demographic breakdowns that revealed the depth of support across different segments of society. Women of all ages supported her position by overwhelming margins, but perhaps more surprisingly, so did a significant majority of men. The British sense of fair play had been offended by the way she had been treated. "There's something else," Victoria added, her tone becoming more serious. "We've had contact from an unexpected source. Lady Catherine Ashworth's representatives reached out this morning requesting a private meeting." Isabella raised an eyebrow in surprise. Throughout this entire crisis, Catherine had remained largely invisible, mentioned in the tabloids but never directly involved in the public aspects of the conflict. Her request for a meeting was intriguing and potentially significant. What does she want? Her representative was very careful not to reveal specifics over the phone, Victoria replied. But the implication was that Lady Catherine has concerns about her position and might be willing to discuss alternatives to the current plan. Isabella considered this development carefully. Catherine was the one person in this entire drama whom she had never met directly, despite the woman's central role in the destruction of her marriage. A face-to-face meeting would be unprecedented and potentially dangerous, but it might also provide insights that could prove crucial to resolving the crisis. "Set it up," Isabella decided. "But I want you present, and I want our conversation recorded. If she's having second thoughts about her role in this conspiracy, I want to understand why." Victoria nodded and made a note in her leather-bound planner. "I'll arrange something for this afternoon. In the meantime, we need to discuss our next strategic move. Edmund's team is clearly hoping that the media pressure will force you to capitulate, but we have the opportunity to seize the initiative." Isabella stood and walked to the large window overlooking the palace courtyard, where she could see increased media activity as reporters and photographers jockeyed for position. The circus had well and truly begun, and she needed to decide how actively she wanted to participate in the spectacle. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "A carefully orchestrated counteroffensive," Victoria replied. "We released selected portions of your recordings from yesterday's meeting, along with a comprehensive statement laying out the constitutional and legal issues at stake. We framed this not as a personal dispute between you and Edmund, but as a fundamental question about the rule of law and constitutional principles." Victoria pulled out a draft statement that she had prepared during the night. Several pages of carefully crafted language that presented Isabella's position with lawyerly precision while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her royal status. The document was a masterpiece of political communication, presenting complex legal arguments in language that would resonate with ordinary citizens. "The key," Victoria explained, "is to shift the narrative away from personal drama toward constitutional principle. The public needs to understand that this isn't about your marriage or your feelings. It's about whether the crown can arbitrarily dispose of inconvenient royal spouses, and whether centuries of legal precedent can be overturned for political convenience." Isabella read through the draft statement carefully, noting how Victoria had woven together legal arguments, constitutional history, and moral principles into a coherent case for her position. The language was strong but measured, forceful but dignified. It was exactly the kind of response that would appeal to the British respect for fair play and constitutional government. "When do we release this?" "This afternoon, immediately following your meeting with Lady Catherine. The timing will be crucial. We want to dominate the evening news cycle and tomorrow's newspapers with our version of events." A knock at the door interrupted their planning session. Margaret Thornfield entered with a silver tray containing what appeared to be an urgent message. Her usually composed expression was troubled, suggesting that the communication contained unwelcome news. "Your Majesty," Margaret said quietly, "this just arrived by special courier from the King's office." The messenger indicated that an immediate response was required. Isabella opened the heavy envelope and read the formal document contained within, her expression growing darker with each paragraph. When she finished, she handed the letter to Victoria without comment, her jaw set in an expression of controlled anger. Victoria scanned the document quickly, her legal training allowing her to immediately grasp the significance of what she was reading. "They're accelerating the timeline," she said grimly. "They want your response to their divorce proposal by tomorrow at noon, with the public announcement to follow immediately." Isabella moved back to the window, her hands clasped behind her back as she processed this latest development. Edmund's advisors were clearly feeling the pressure from the negative publicity and were attempting to force a resolution before her position could strengthen further. "They're panicking," she observed. "Yesterday, they had all the time in the world to orchestrate their palace coup. Now they're trying to rush through their solution before the constitutional and political opposition can organize effectively." Victoria nodded in agreement. which suggests that our strategy is working. They're reacting to our moves rather than implementing their carefully planned timeline. The question is whether we allow them to dictate the pace of events or whether we seize control of the schedule ourselves. Isabella turned back from the window, her decision clear in her expression. We accelerate our own timeline. I want that statement ready for release within 2 hours. I want the meeting with Lady Catherine moved to early afternoon. And I want our allies in Parliament and the judiciary to understand that this is now a time-sensitive crisis that requires immediate attention. Victoria began gathering her materials, already mentally organizing the complex sequence of events that would need to unfold over the next few hours. Your Majesty, once we release that statement and make our recordings public, there will be no possibility of a quiet resolution. This will become a full-scale constitutional crisis played out in the media and the courts. Isabella smiled, and there was something almost predatory in her expression. Victoria, I think you're still underestimating the situation. This already is a full-scale constitutional crisis. Edmund and his advisors created it when they decided to ambush me with their ultimatum. The only question now is whether they control the narrative or whether we do. She moved to her desk and began signing the authorizations Victoria would need to implement their accelerated plan. I've spent 15 years serving this monarchy faithfully, supporting my husband through every crisis, maintaining dignity in the face of every challenge. I've earned the right to fight for my position, and I intend to use every weapon at my disposal. Victoria stood to leave, her briefcase packed with the legal ammunition they would need for the battles ahead. Your Majesty, Edmund and his advisors expected you to go quietly into exile. They're about to discover that they've awakened a formidable opponent. Isabella looked out at the media circus surrounding the palace, where reporters were already speculating about her next move. In a few hours, they would have their answer, and the entire kingdom would understand that Queen Consort Isabella Ravencrest was not going down without a fight. The war for her crown was about to reach a new level of intensity, and she was ready for whatever came next. Let them come, she said quietly. I've been preparing for this battle my entire life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace's private garden as Isabella waited for what would prove to be the most crucial conversation of her life. Lady Catherine Ashworth arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, accompanied only by her personal assistant and a single bodyguard, a deliberately understated entrance that contrasted sharply with the media circus raging beyond the palace gates. Catherine appeared younger than her 32 years, her auburn hair catching the light as she walked with the kind of natural grace that had first attracted Edmund's attention. Victoria Blackwood sat beside Isabella at a small wrought iron table that had been set up beneath an ancient oak tree, far from any windows where their conversation might be observed by palace staff or photographed by telephoto lenses. The setting was deliberately informal, designed to encourage honest dialogue rather than the rigid protocol that typically governed royal encounters. Catherine approached with visible nervousness, her confident public persona clearly strained by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. She was elegantly dressed in a simple navy suit that suggested both respect for the formality of meeting the Queen Consort and awareness that this was not a social occasion. As she took her seat across from Isabella, the tension between the three women was palpable. Your Majesty, Catherine began, her voice steady despite the obvious stress she was experiencing. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I realize this situation is unprecedented and uncomfortable for all of us. Isabella studied the younger woman carefully, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating complex social situations. Despite being the catalyst for the destruction of her marriage, Isabella found herself acknowledging that Catherine possessed the kind of natural presence that would indeed make her effective as a royal consort under different circumstances. Lady Catherine, Isabella replied formally, I agreed to this meeting because your representative suggested you might have information relevant to the current crisis. I hope you understand that any conversation we have will be recorded and may be used in legal proceedings. Catherine nodded, apparently having expected this condition. I understand completely, and I accept those terms. What I have to say is important enough that I'm willing to have it documented. Victoria activated the small recording device she had placed on the table between them, then settled back to observe the exchange between the two women whose fates had become so unexpectedly intertwined. As Isabella's legal advocate, she was particularly interested in any admissions or revelations that might strengthen their position in the constitutional battle ahead. Catherine took a deep breath before continuing. Your Majesty, I want you to know that I never sought to become involved in a conspiracy to remove you from your position. When I first developed feelings for Edmund, I was led to believe that your marriage was effectively over and that divorce proceedings were already being considered for other reasons. Isabella's expression remained carefully neutral, but Victoria could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested intense interest in this revelation. What other reasons were you given? I was told that you had become increasingly isolated and difficult to work with, that you had expressed private doubts about continuing in your role, and that there were concerns about your emotional stability following your difficulties with childbearing. Catherine's voice faltered slightly as she spoke these words, clearly uncomfortable with repeating what she now understood to be fabrications. Isabella felt a surge of anger at the character assassination that had apparently been conducted behind her back, but she maintained her composure as she pressed for more details. Who told you these things? Lord Chancellor Pemberton initially, during what I believed was a routine discussion about my appointment to the Royal Opera Board. He suggested that the royal family was undergoing some internal restructuring and that there might be opportunities for increased involvement in royal duties for qualified individuals. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she continued. The conversations became more specific over several months, with Sir James Whitmore providing what he described as legal and constitutional context. Victoria leaned forward, recognizing the significance of what Catherine was revealing. Lady Catherine, are you saying that you were recruited into this conspiracy rather than initiating it yourself? Catherine nodded emphatically. Absolutely. I was approached systematically over a period of months, with each conversation revealing slightly more about their plans. By the time I understood the full scope of what was being proposed, I had already developed genuine feelings for Edmund and felt trapped by circumstances I hadn't created. Isabella studied Catherine's expression carefully, using the psychological assessment skills she had developed during her diplomatic career. The younger woman appeared to be telling the truth, her distress seeming genuine rather than calculated. But Isabella needed to understand the full extent of the conspiracy and Catherine's role within it. What was your understanding of the timeline for these changes? Isabella asked. Catherine reached into her handbag and removed a small notebook, consulting it before responding. Initially, I was told that any changes would take place gradually over a period of years. The suggestion was that you might choose to step back from royal duties voluntarily, perhaps due to health concerns or personal preferences. The idea of involuntary divorce was never mentioned until much later in the process. Victoria exchanged a meaningful glance with Isabella, both women recognizing the legal significance of this timeline. The conspiracy had been in development for far longer than they had suspected, with Catherine being groomed for her role as a replacement queen long before the current crisis erupted. Lady Catherine, Victoria interjected, do you have any documentation of these conversations? Any written communications that might corroborate what you're telling us? Catherine nodded and reached into her handbag again, this time removing a small collection of letters and documents. I kept records of our conversations, initially out of excitement about my increasing involvement with royal activities, later out of concern about the direction things were taking. Isabella examined the documents Catherine had provided, her diplomatic training helping her quickly identify the most significant elements. There were handwritten notes from meetings with Lord Chancellor Pemberton, copies of letters discussing her gradual integration into royal responsibilities, and even preliminary discussions about her eventual coronation ceremony. This suggests a level of premeditation that goes far beyond anything we suspected, Victoria observed grimly. This wasn't a response to a marital crisis. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to replace the queen consort that began over a year ago. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued her revelations. There's something else you need to know. The financial arrangements being proposed for your Majesty's exile aren't as generous as they appear. The legal documents contain clauses that would allow the Crown to reclaim most of the settlement under various circumstances, including any public criticism of the royal family or legal challenges to the divorce proceedings. Isabella felt her anger rising as she realized the full extent of the trap that had been set for her. Not only were Edmund's advisors attempting to dispose of her involuntarily, but they were also ensuring that she would remain financially dependent and legally constrained even after her removal from royal life. What changed your mind about participating in this plan? Isabella asked directly. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with emotions that went beyond the political and legal implications of their conversation. Two things, she said finally. First, I began to understand that Edmund doesn't love me the way I thought he did. His feelings are bound up with political necessity and the pressure from his advisors rather than genuine affection. Second, I realized that what was being done to you was fundamentally wrong, regardless of the political justifications being offered. She looked directly at Isabella, her eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt and determination. Your Majesty, you have served this kingdom faithfully for 15 years. You've conducted yourself with dignity through personal tragedies that would have broken lesser people. You deserve better than to be discarded like a political inconvenience. Isabella felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to Catherine's confession. Despite everything, she found herself developing a grudging respect for the younger woman's apparent integrity and her willingness to risk her own position by revealing the conspiracy. Lady Catherine, Isabella said carefully, what you're telling us could destroy your relationship with Edmund and eliminate any possibility of your becoming queen. Are you prepared for those consequences? Catherine nodded without hesitation. Your Majesty, I've had 3 days to think about what kind of person I want to be and what kind of life I want to live. I don't want to be remembered as the woman who helped destroy a good queen so that she could steal her crown. I don't want to build my happiness on your humiliation and exile. Victoria was already making notes about how Catherine's revelations could be incorporated into their legal strategy. The documentation of the long-term conspiracy would significantly strengthen their constitutional challenge, while Catherine's willingness to testify could provide crucial corroboration for their arguments. Lady Catherine, Victoria said, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about everything you've told us today? Would you be prepared to testify in court if necessary? Catherine's response was immediate and unequivocal. Yes, to both questions. I understand that this decision will have serious consequences for my future, but I can't continue to participate in something I now understand to be fundamentally wrong. Isabella stood and walked to the edge of the garden, looking out over the landscape where tourists and media representatives continued their vigil beyond the palace walls. The conversation with Catherine had provided her with exactly the ammunition she needed to destroy Edmund's conspiracy, but it had also forced her to confront the personal dimensions of the crisis in ways she hadn't anticipated. Catherine, she said, turning back to face the younger woman, I want you to understand something. This battle isn't just about my marriage or my position. It's about the fundamental principles that govern our constitutional monarchy. If we allow this precedent to be established, no future royal spouse will have any security or protection against political convenience. Catherine nodded soberly. I understand, Your Majesty, and I want to help you fight it, even if it means sacrificing my own dreams of becoming queen. Victoria finished organizing the documents Catherine had provided and looked up at both women. Ladies, with Lady Catherine's cooperation, we now have everything we need to destroy the conspiracy against Queen Isabella's position. The question is whether we pursue total victory or whether we seek a negotiated settlement that preserves everyone's dignity. Isabella returned to the table and sat down, her decision already made. Victoria, I want you to prepare for total victory. Edmund and his advisors chose to treat this as a war rather than a negotiation. They're about to discover that they picked the wrong opponent. She turned to Catherine with an expression that mixed respect with residual wariness. Lady Catherine, if you're truly committed to exposing this conspiracy, then I suggest you prepare yourself for what comes next. Once we release this information, there will be no going back for any of us. Catherine met Isabella's gaze steadily. Your Majesty, I'm ready. I'd rather face the consequences of doing the right thing than live with the knowledge that I helped destroy something good for my own selfish benefit. As the three women concluded their unprecedented meeting, the sun was setting over the palace gardens, casting the ancient stones in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to reflect the momentous nature of what had just transpired. Isabella had entered the crisis alone, facing seemingly insurmountable odds against her survival as queen consort. Now, with Victoria's legal expertise and Catherine's explosive revelations, she possessed the weapons she needed not just to survive, but to completely destroy the conspiracy that had threatened to end her royal life. The final battle for her crown was about to begin, and Queen Consort Isabella Ravencrest was ready to fight it with everything she had learned during her remarkable life of service, diplomacy, and unwavering determination. Edmund and his advisors had awakened a formidable opponent, and they were about to pay the price for their miscalculation in ways they could never have imagined. The war was far from over, but for the first time since this crisis began, Isabella knew she was going to win.